Okay, our next session is called Unified Approach to FOIA Data Governance. With us is Dan Manners, VP of Product Strategy for Archive 360. I can see you there, Dan. We're going to advance your slides, so take it away, Dan.
Great. So, hi everybody. First off, I should say that that session by Eric was really terrific, and it's a great lead-in to some of the things that we'll talk about in today's session. So, why don't we just advance to the next slide, please? So, we've introduced the topic, unified approach to FOIA data governance. So, really very quickly, a quick spin through my background. So I've been in the field for some time and very much focused always on emerging technologies, regulatory compliance, which in current day terms always crosses over with data privacy and information governance. A big part of my career had been focused within financial institutions, which are regulated entities, obviously, and very much focused around providing services around e-discovery, especially around electronic communications and archiving that those modes, and eventually spawning off into doing information management and risk consulting, and then eventually landing where I am now at Archive 360. Where if folks don't really kind of know too much about us, we are an information data governance platform provider, managing really data around both unstructured and structured to meet business compliance regulatory requirements. It's a cloud native solution, highly scalable and secure, and we'll get a bit into that as we go through the discussion today. So why don't we launch in quickly into next slide, please. So the agenda, and today we only have 30 minutes. I've got about an hour's worth of material packed into that 30 minutes, so try to get through as much as we can, and I'll take advantage of a couple extra minutes from Eric. So I'm expecting to really go through talking a little bit about data growth, the challenges which many of you are very familiar with, obviously, in trying to complete your FOIA requests or in your environments, talking a bit about data types, and then really leading into where the federal initiatives are going and where that whole direction is pointed to, which makes a very good sense. And then talking a bit about our integrated data governance platform, and then leading into the conclusions. So next slide, please. We'll launch into the topic. So I thought that this was really kind of a very interesting factoid and slide. You'll always see similar kind of information from many different kind of perspectives. And it really ties a little bit also into what Eric was starting to kind of talk about. And what you see here is really the explosion of growth of data. So compounded annual growth rate for both structured and unstructured. And as you see in the purple, is obviously a huge explosion in comparison to structured data. And that makes kind of perfect sense, as both the government as well as private sectors are really starting to drive much more into the use of AI technologies and large language models. And what's very kind of interesting about that is that at this point of time, what ends up being current is in the fact is that technology will ultimately both be a driver, because AI will help create yet new records, and ultimately that it will be a big part of also what eventually over time becomes much more well adopted strategies, as Eric was kind of talking about the pilot programs and the use of AI and ML to be able to help even solve some of those challenges that it produces. So a very interesting point of perspective or inflection point of time. And what this also really kind of leads you to recognize, and I think Eric also mentioned this, is in the fact of that with that level of explosive growth, that frankly that there is just simply no way manual approaches will work over a long time, and people are struggling with them obviously now, and nor will really legacy approaches work as well. So the mindset of due to this kind of explosive growth really has to change. Next slide, please. So again, not telling everybody, many things that they don't know, but ultimately, much of the FOIA requests that all of you receive in your different kind of agencies are really defined by different types of data. So when we think about that in terms of unstructured data or semi-structured or structured and then physical, which we'll kind of leave off to the side for a few minutes. What's very important really about that is to understand, and we talked about, or I just heard Eric kind of talk about a centralized system for some of the records that he was referring to. And that's an important kind of concept in the fact of that many of these types of records which are produced, they're produced in different systems. So Eric was talking about messages, may have a centralized repository for those. But many of them ultimately are produced and then retained within those separate different repositories themselves, right? And each of them equally carry with them certain information or lack certain information based upon the uniqueness of the type of information that's contained. But again, without proper technology, it's more and more challenging. And again, we'll leave a bit off to the side for kind of a moment about the physical, because that's much more about manual kind of processes. So if we can move over to the next slide, please. Great. So part of the process, and again, not trying to tell you what many of you know very well, but part of the process is post the receipt and the validation of the request that you get, and the validation of that is then the next important stage, which is really kind of where much of my focus in today's discussion really is about the ability to then perform the searches for the types of data that are relevant to that kind of a request. And many of us kind of recognize that that's exactly where the challenge is, or much of the time of which that there is a time clock on these kind of requests gets burned up, right? So it takes a lot of time to search across many of those different systems that we were just kind of talking about, those different types of data types that are organized in. And especially what adds complexity is if they're not well organized, and clearly if they span kind of many years. And the fact of that reliance upon that outdated technology, or no technology in the case of where there are still paper records, is truly proves very challenging. Some of that data may reside on on-premise services, servers or workstations, or frankly even at times found on laptops. All of that contributes to the added pressure and the fact of creating these huge volumes of backlogs of those requests. And that's all also balanced with the transparency and the security that we all know that we have to pay attention to those requests themselves. Balancing those two things can be very tricky and time-consuming kind of process. And as Eric started to say, some of that starts to get balanced over time, especially as the models, ML models that Eric was referring to, really start to get delivered. But that will take obviously some time, as Eric was saying. There's a pilot program in place. It takes time to start to introduce that type of information. If we can we move to the next slide? Yep, next slide, please. Great. All right. So here, this is a very interesting kind of point, and one of which that we tend to always get very focused within the particular area of our focal points. And so here, much of the challenges, and we were just talking about outdated technology, right? We really refer to that as legacy, right? So legacy data and applications. And that's not really a unique problem, or a challenge that's really relegated just to the public area. It's very much in the private space as well. And so this is some interesting information, and the fact of how much of a challenge or a risk that these types of environments are really keeping into those spaces. So in a recent study, so as much as 80% of the business data as part of a poll was found to be on what we consider legacy environments, right? And legacy environments are really defined as systems which are maintaining critical information and which necessarily need to be able to meet all of the requirements that we would imagine that a current operational system are, but have obviously challenges because they are indeed legacy. And it was found in that one study that over 80%, well, 80% of the financial institutions had at least one breach due to a legacy challenge. Very similarly, you know, the analogy falls over into the public space, right? And in a recent study, which was released in May 23, so not too long ago, out of a survey across 65 different agencies, the 10 most mission critical systems were found to range from 8 to 51 years old. So I think in everybody's view of that, you know, 51 years old, it would be considered legacy. And frankly, an exorbitant amount of money being spent to maintain those systems. And what's really kind of interesting, or what's common really kind of across that, both again, public and private, no distinction here, is in the fact that when you look at those legacy systems, that there are generally broad sets of people who no longer really need access. And as many of us kind of understand, that starts to break some of the data privacy principles by which that we all need to adhere to, regardless whether they are just that we're interested in being responsive to FOIA requests or not. The base elements are that we are protecting the data and the privacy of that data for the public or the clients, whichever space you're looking at. And what's also very consistent with that is that legacy environments are not typically maintained like current environments. And sometimes that's just simply in the virtue, the fact that those environments are just no longer even supported by vendors any longer. So patching or vulnerability to that are just simply not even possible. But what's truly important here is at the end of the day, those legacy environments, they're legacy because they are obviously old. They were built with an intent or a vision to serve a different purpose. And so looking at and relying upon those types of systems prove obviously that they are highly inefficient to both search and retrieve, especially when you're talking about massive amounts of data. The architecture just simply wasn't envisioned nor put into place. And many of them were not necessarily designed with the intent of being, frankly, being able to hold on to data for that long period of time, which adds or compounds to the challenge of them being inefficient to both search and retrieve. So can we move to the next slide, please? Great. So given that backdrop, so we've talked a little bit about the fact is that there's explosive data growth. The fact that all of these different types of data, whether it's unstructured or structured, kind of live and exist in kind of different places and have unique attributes, many of them living on to a legacy environment. Where does it really kind of bring us, or where is the direction, or where is the momentum in which I'm characterizing, frankly, as a very positive one, right? So many of us, if not all of us, are extremely familiar with M1921 and, you know, the more recent M2307, right? All about the fact is ensuring that we're moving away, again, from those manual processes, right? To ensure that there's a consistent, reliable, and, you know, key privacy preserving access to that information. Being manual adds, paper-based, adds nothing really to that process, which is why that there was a very smart direction being kind of chosen and now obviously kind of mandate. And what's important about just that process is not just necessarily the digitization of those records, but the requirements in order to ensure that there's appropriate metadata that's associated with that information. And the metadata is the basis by which that information can be properly understood, classified, organized, and delivered into systems of which that will enable better, smarter processes. So very positive kind of direction there as well. But again, it's only kind of the part of what needs to be done, not necessarily the how. Second part of this is equally, and again, drawing a very close analogy into the private world, is the cloud computing strategy. So again, digitization of things, putting into electronic format, but equally then putting them into the cloud. And very much makes sense, not just necessarily because we are a cloud provider, but the fact is that what the cloud has to offer. And it's all in that positive direction in the fact of that it's very difficult for any individual agency, federal agency, state agency, or private institution to really be able to individually meet or drive as much technology or solutioning that actually the cloud providers can do. And there's a huge advantage of being able to take that approach and being able to leverage that as much as possible. So if we can, next slide. So all of that again was kind of leading up into the basis of speaking about the data in itself, right? And when we look at really the unified data continuum, and I think Eric kind of talked about this as well about centralized repositories, the fact is that much of different data types have unique data, unique attributes about them. And you start to look at from the unstructured all the way into the structured, and they really start to look at what those values are. So from an electronic communications perspective, you think about that from a artifact kind of basis, an email, a particular communication. There's a very solidness to that, to what that form or format is, and what metadata may be aligned with that. And we're always talking about how eventually to be able to appropriately manage that information and what information can inherently comes with those types of platforms or mediums. So electronic communications, many times when you think about an email, there's always a from, there's a to, there's a subject, there's a date. And some of that may be sufficient to provide some context as to what that holds, and then there's more about that typically held within the body. As you start to look further to the right, files and documents. Many of us think about your network file share, or if you're in Microsoft 365, your OneDrive. There are individual files that have been produced and which are retained and may be relevant. But frankly, all of that information is held, and so some of that information, I should say, is inherent as part of those files as well. So think about who was the creator, who was the author, when was it last modified, what was kind of the date, but also not being terribly good at being categorized, especially when they are retained within those remote the systems and platforms, if you will. Continuing on to the continuum, there's different types of documents held in kind of different systems. So you think about some of the enterprise content management systems that many of us are very familiar with. Maybe documents, there may be already some level of kind of metadata which has been associated with those, but even that needs to be embellished when you're talking about being highly efficient in a centralized process where time is really extremely valuable, and being able to find that documentation or those documents. And then continuing into kind of what I would think is less of an artifact based, and meaning that data being embedded within a different format. And that's where we start talking about things like structured flat files, which may or may not have necessarily associated documents. So a file about a court proceeding that's held within one particular system, and then maybe associated documents which talk about the disposition of that particular case, all being relegated as being the need to be associated with each other. And continuing with that, then there's, frankly, obviously, many of the systems are very much database driven. And again, now not necessarily having the most robust amount of data, metadata associated with that, because the context is very deep within those tables and many times used for reporting. So what needs to be extracted or put into the appropriate shape as part of metadata is embedded within that. And all of that has to be a very thoughtful process. And when we talk about the most extreme is when you're talking about very complicated systems like ERP systems, of which that there are millions of transactions across thousands of tables. And the treatment of that, in order to be able to find what it is that you need to find in order to be responsive to the actual request, gets complicated. But there are very thoughtful kind of ways in order to ultimately be able to extract out what is important, putting that into metadata, regardless of now the nature of that being unstructured all the way through structured, and putting that into a platform of which that can both easily consume it and then act upon it as necessary. So if we can continue. Great. So Archive 360's unified data governance platform. So a little bit on the actual platform in itself. The way in which that we really look at our platform is in three logical buckets, if you will. So the first is in collect, the second manage, and the last access. And what's very important to understand about that is that each one of these phases ultimately depend upon the other for their success. So when we're talking about collection, this is literally, again, as we talked about earlier, the different context about the different modes or mediums of data of which that's being collected. And each one of these, what's important is that you're able to separate the context and the type of how each one of those data streams are being addressed. So a prime example of that is as we start to talk about unstructured documents themselves and things that you might be keeping within a file share or maybe even a SharePoint. The point of that is in the fact of treatment of that data. There may be inherent information that is useful as part of metadata, as part of those documents, but it's not full and robust. And so part of a process or a thoughtful process has to be taking and driving more context from those particular types of data sources and data themselves and driving that into the metadata, of which that will eventually get into a platform like ours and be able to be managed appropriately. Another large basis or perspective is when you start to think about the enterprise applications. And if you remember back to the slide before, we're really now talking about much more structured data coming out from very complex kind of systems themselves. And what tends to be when you're thinking about legacy data and enterprise applications, you tend to find that there's a big amount of that preponderance of data in exactly that, legacy enterprise applications. And what tends to happen in both public and private is in the fact of those applications are stood up and maintained for an extraordinarily amount of time at really challenging perspectives and at high cost. But ultimately, the application in itself is no longer really useful. What they're being stood up for or being retained for is because they are holding critical information. And in our approach, by working with our clients, we're able to extricate or take what is only necessary from those applications and being able to bring them into our platform in a way of which that they become an ability to be searched upon and retrieved upon, so on and so forth, without having to take over the entire application. So it's a very thoughtful kind of approach about retaining what is actually necessary, and ultimately that's helping the entire process because you're not necessarily trolling through older applications in less than modern architecture. So all of that really starts to really bring us forward into kind of the managed side. And again, I started out the really kind of the discussion upon that we're a platform that's built upon the cloud. And being built upon the cloud is extremely important because there's architectural decisions that need to get made as when you are building your application. And when there are certain applications which have been built under a on-premise perspective and then moved into cloud, they're really kind of dealing with a lot of legacy problems. The cloud, being cloud native, allows us to really leverage what is, frankly, available by many of those cloud providers themselves. One of the key aspects of our platform is really talking about encryption. And in this context, I'll talk about encryption at a lower level, meaning at a data level. And bringing in some of those email messages or some of the unstructured file content. What's extremely important, and actually Eric referred to this equally before, is about the ability when taking in that data of us being able to understand what that data is and being able to encrypt it at a field level. So meaning that as you've defined certain information as being sensitive or being defined as PII, that we have the ability to mask that data. So mask it or redact it, depends upon how you'd like to speak about that function. But what's critically important about that as well is that that's tied into our ability to really entitle information. Now, entitlement can be allowing somebody to see a particular set of data or to go down into such granular extremes about allowing people to see data, but not necessarily the data of which that we've deemed sensitive or for private. So it starts to even be able to segregate the types of workers of which that have the ability to search upon the complete corpus of data in itself, which is extremely important, especially when you start to think about cross-agency reviews, meaning being able to open up certain pieces or classes of data or different types of records to different agencies as well. There's that possibility of being able to restrict them down to a very low level. All of this is always predicated upon, when bringing in data, being able to set the right governance policies associated with them. What is the proper retention based upon that classification, aligning a record class, whether that's really defined at an agency level and imported into our system, or frankly created within our system, that ability to define at a record class level how information should be retained and for how long, based upon either a particular event or based upon a particular duration. Again, flexibility in how that's being looked at. And that ultimately leads to, frankly, disposal, even though that's many times a bit of a challenge, not necessarily from a technology perspective, but from a policy perspective. One of the important things, again, I'm saying that, collect, manage, and access each build upon themselves. One of them is important in this context of content and metadata index. All over from the NARA guidelines, and for many kind of different kind of reasons, right? There's a huge importance upon the metadata. Metadata itself can be indexed and searched, and that alone creates huge efficiencies of getting to tremendous volumes of data quickly. But not necessarily all forms of information require only metadata indexing, some of which at times necessarily need the full content indexed as well. And what's important is being able to distinguish between those different types of information and what type of indexing is necessary. And always, that leads you to kind of storage. One of the huge advantages of the cloud is being able to leverage really inexpensive storage. So collect, manage, and now access. And this is where you start to talk about, the flexibility of being able to, when you're able to centralize all these legacy systems and even more of the active systems into a central repository, you start to think about how can you make it available in multitudes of different ways. There's the very clear and obvious ways of integrating with e-discovery efforts, either our own or third parties, but making that data easily consumable in multiple different ways. So for example, through powerful analytical tools like Power BI. But one of those also additional ways is, as Eric was talking about, and as the programs about AI and ML further develop, about the ability for us to take exports of what's now a huge amount of data, which gets built up over time, and making that available to third-party ML engines. So as the tools start to develop and as they are better and better refined, there's this a keen ability for us to either export or over time, really for those AI and ML models to really be introspective into our platform as well. So a huge amount of flexibility about leveraging that data. If we can move along, please. I know I've got a couple more minutes, so I'll try to speed it up. So one of the things I really want to also make sure again is that when you talk about cloud native applications, right, it's all about scalability and about the extensibility of the architecture in itself and how people interact with that. And so you need to be very thoughtful in the fact of how people are working and where the data kind of sits. And the models have to kind of change under that basis themselves. So people are very interactive with their network file shares or their OneDrive. And so you have to be able to necessarily allow people to operate in a normal mode, but still being able to continuously take and retrieve that data or put into the archive the authoritative copy of that data, of which that ultimately most of the FOIA requests would ultimately want to rely upon. There's equally not just humans who are involved in this process, but huge amounts of data coming from applications, either being consumed into those applications or being produced into the archive from those applications. And of course, as we show here about the unified governance and analytics. And one of the very big things that comes up all the time is about encryption. And encryption here, not just at the data level, but at a macro level. And again, leveraging tools like ours, we have the capabilities to encrypt every piece of data going into the archive before it ever leaves a data center or premise, before going into the cloud. And the only way for that data to be really retrieved in a decrypted format is to go back to the original agency. So huge amounts of security, even hybrid models of where it's referred to as bring your own keys within the cloud environment, of where an agency can hold on to its own set of keys, specifically even the providers not being able to gain access to that. And because there's a segregation between where the keys are held and where the data is held. So really limiting that exposure. If we can move to the next slide.
Hey, Dan, we have a minute. So.
Okay. Yep, I will. So I had a couple case studies. I think we're handing these out. So ultimately, the folks can really take a look at that as well. But to give a little bit of order of magnitude of the types of clients that we're dealing with and the huge amounts of volume that's been provided. And I'll just close by kind of saying, look, ultimately, this is about understanding where your important data lives. Many of that we kind of recognize are in legacy environments, and being able to retire that data as makes sense, and moving that into a centralized process of where that you can really take advantage of all of the ability to manage this in a very consistent way. And the more that you can do that allows for more efficient process or time of your other downstream activities. With that, Mike.
Dan, thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation. Excellent job. We're going to go to our first poll question of the day. Okay, this is your opportunity for those of you familiar with our programming. This is your opportunity to schedule a follow-up call with the subject matter expert for Archive 360 to continue the discussion on FOIA data governance. So you could say yes if you'd like someone to call you to continue the discussion, or no, not at this time. I also wanted to remind you while you're completing this that a copy of Dan's presentation is in the handout section, so you can download it if you'd like.